Chapter 40. Selena groaned as something cold and wet brushed her cheek and moved to lick her face. She opened an eye and found the puppy looking down at her, its tail wagging. Adjusting herself in the bed, she winced at the sunlight. She hadn't meant to sleep in. They had a test in 2 days, and she needed to train. It was their last test before the final duel, the test that decided who the 4 finalists would be. Selena rubbed an eye and scratched the dog behind the ears. "Have you peed somewhere and wished to tell me about it?" "Oh, no," said someone as the bedroom door swung open. "Dorian." "I took her out at dawn with the other dogs." She smiled weakly as he approached. "Isn't it rather early for a visit?" "Early?" He laughed, sitting on the bed. She inched away. "It's almost 1 in the afternoon. Philippa told me you've been sleeping like the dead all morning." 1? She'd slept that long? What about lessons with Cole? She scratched her nose and pulled the puppy onto her lap. At least nothing had happened last night. If there'd been another attack, she would have heard about it already. She almost sighed with relief that the guilt of what she had done, how little faith she'd had in Nehemia, still made her a tad miserable. "Have you named her yet?" he asked. Casual, calm, collected. Was he acting that way for show, or was their kiss just not that important to him? "No," she said, keeping her face neutral, even though she wanted to scream from the awkwardness. "I can't think of anything appropriate." "What about," he said, tapping his chin, "Gold? That's the stupidest name I've ever heard. Can you think of something better?" She picked up one of the dog's legs and examined the paws. She squished the padded foot beneath her thumb. Fleetfoot. It was a perfect name. In fact, it felt as if the name had existed all along, and she'd finally been clairvoyant enough to stumble across it. "Yes, Fleetfoot it is." "Does it mean anything?" he asked, and the dog raised the head to look at him. "It'll mean something which outruns all your purebreds." Selena scooped the dog into her arms and kissed her hard head. She bounced her arms up and down, and Fleetfoot stared up into her eyes with a wrinkled brow. She was absurdly soft and cuddly. Dorian chuckled. "We'll see." Selena set the dog down on the bed. Fleetfoot promptly crawled on the blankets and disappeared. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. "Yes, though it seems you didn't, if you're up so early." "Listen," he began, and Selena wanted to throw herself from the balcony. "Last night, I'm sorry if I was too forward with you." He paused. "Selena, you're grimacing." Had she been making a face? Sorry. Did it did upset you then?" "What did? The kiss?" Phlegm caught in her throat, and the assassin coughed. It was nothing," she said, thumping her chest as she cleared her throat. "I didn't mind it, but I didn't hate it, if that's what you're thinking." She immediately regretted saying it. "So, you liked it?" He grinned lazily. "No, oh, go away." She flung herself onto her pillows, pulling the blankets above her head. She was going to die from embarrassment. Fleetfoot licked her face as she hid in the darkness of the sheets. "Come on now," he said. "From your reaction, one would have thought you'd never been kissed." She threw back the blankets, and Fleetfoot burrowed further beneath. "Of course I've been kissed," she snapped, trying to think about Sam and what she'd shared with him. "But it wasn't by some stuffed-shirt, pompous, arrogant princeling." He looked down at his chest. "Stuffed shirt?" "Oh, hush up," she said, hitting him with a pillow. She moved to the other side of the bed, got up, and walked to the balcony. She felt him watching her, staring at her back and the 3 scars she knew her low-cut nightgown did nothing to hide. "Are you going to remain here while I change?" She faced him. He wasn't looking at her the way he had the night before. There was something wary in his gaze, and something unspeakably sad. Her heart thrummed in her veins. "Well?" "Your scars are awful," he said, almost whispering. She put her hand on her hip and walked to the dressing-door room. "We all bear scars, Dorian. Mine just happen to be more visible than most. Sit there if you like, but I'm going to get dressed." She strode from the room. Caitlin walked beside Duke Parrington through the endless tables of the palace greenhouse, The giant glass building was full of shadows and light, and she found herself as the steamy heat smothered her face. The man picked the most absurd places to walk. She had about as much interest in the plants and flowers as she did in a mud puddle on the side of a street. He picked a lily, snow white, and handed it to her with a bow of his head. For you? She tried not to cringe at the sight of his pocked, ruddy skin and orange mustache. The thought of being stuck with him made her want to rip all the plants out by their roots and throw them into the snow. Thank you, she said huskily, but Parrington studied her closely. You seem out of spirits today, Lady Caitlin. Do I? She cocked her head in her coyest expression. Perhaps today pales in comparison to the fun I had at the ball last night. The Duke's black eyes bored into her, and he frowned as he put a hand on her elbow and steered her on. You needn't pretend with me. I noticed you watching the Crown Prince. Caitlin gave nothing away, as she raised her manicured brows and looked sidelong at him. Was I? Parrington ran a meaty finger down the spine of her fern. The black ring on his finger pulsed, and her head gave a throb of pain in response. I noticed him too. The girl, specifically. She's troublesome, isn't she? Lady Lillian? Caitlin blinked this time, unsure whether she could sag with relief just yet. He hadn't noticed her wanting the prince, but rather that she noticed how Lillian and Dorian clung to each other all night. So she calls herself, Parrington murmured. That's not a name? Caitlin asked before she could think. The Duke turned to her, his eyes as black as his ring. You don't honestly believe that that girl is a purebred lady? Caitlin's heart stopped. She's truly not? And then Parrington smiled and finally told her everything. When Parrington finished, Caitlin could only stare at him. An assassin. Lillian Goidana was a Selena Sardathine, the world's most notorious assassin, and she had her claws in Dorian's heart. If Caitlin wanted Dorian's hand, then she need to be far, far cleverer. Simply revealing who Lillian truly was might not be enough. But it might not. Caitlin couldn't afford to take risks. The greenhouse was silent, as if it held its breath. How can we let this go on? How can we allow the prince to endanger himself like that? Parrington's face shifted for a moment towards something pained and ugly, but it was so fast she barely noticed it above the pounding rising in her head. She needed her pipe, needed to calm down before she had a fit. We can't, Parrington said. But how can we stop them? Tell the king? Parrington shook his head, putting a hand on his broadsword as he thought for a moment. She examined a rosebush and traced a long nail along the curve of a thorn. She's to face the remaining champions in a duel, he said slowly. And in the duel, she'll drink a toast in honor of the goddess and the gods. It wasn't just the too-tight corset that stole the breath from Caitlin as the Duke went on. She lowered a hand from the thorn. I was going to ask you to preside over the toast, as a representation of the goddess. Perhaps you could slip something into a drink. Kill her myself? Hiring someone was one thing, but to do it herself? The Duke raised his hands. No. But the king has agreed that most drastic measures should be taken in a way that will make Dorian believe things were an accident. If we were merely to give her a dose of bloodbane, not lethal, but just enough to cause her to lose control, it would give Cain the advantage he needs. Cain can't kill her on his own. Accidents happen all the time in duels. Her head gave a sharp, intense throb that echoed throughout her body. Maybe drugging her might be easier. Cain thinks he can, but I don't like taking risks. Parrington grasped her hands. His ring was ice cold against the skin, and she fought the urge to rip her hands from his grip. Don't you want to help Dorian? Once he's free of her, then he'll be mine. He'll be mine, as he should be. But to kill for it, he'll be mine. Then we'll be able to get him on the right path, won't we? Parrington finished with a broad smile that made her instincts tell her to run and never look back. But all her mind could see was a crown and a throne, and the prince who sat by her side. Tell me what I need to do, she said. Chapter 41. The clock chimed 10, and Selina, seated at the small desk in her bedroom, looked up from a book. She should be sleeping, or at least trying to. Fleetfoot, dozing on her lap, yawned widely. Selina scratched her behind the ears and ran a hand along the page of the book. Wardmark stared up at her, the intricate curves and angles speaking a language she couldn't yet begin to decipher. How long had it been for Nehemia to learn them? And she wondered, darkly, how could their power possibly still work, when magic itself was gone? She hadn't seen Nehemia since the ball last night, hadn't dared to approach her or tell Cola what she'd learned. Nehemia had been deceitful about her language skills, and how much she knew about the Wardmarks, but she couldn't. She could have a number of reasons for that. Selina had been wrong to go to the ball last night, wrong to believe Nehemia was capable of such bad things. Nehemia is one of the good ones. She wouldn't talk at Selina, not when they'd been friends. They had been friends. Selina swallowed the tightness in her throat and turned the page. Her heart stopped. There, looking up at her, were the symbols she had seen near the bodies, and in the margin written by someone centuries ago was the explanation. For sacrifices to the Ridderak, using the victim's blood, mark the area around it accordingly. Once the creature has been summoned, these marks guide the exchange for the flesh of the sacrifice. The beast will grant you the victim's strength. Selina fought to keep her hands from trembling as she flipped through the pages, searching for anything about the marks under her bed. When the book yielded nothing, she returned to the summoning spell. A Ridderak. That was the name of the beast? What was it? Where had it been summoned from? If it wasn't... The ward gates. She pressed the heels of her palms into her eyes. Someone was actually using the ward marks to open a portal to summon this creature. It was impossible, because magic was gone. But the text said ward marks existed outside of magic. What if their power still worked? But Nehemia. How could her friend do such a thing? Why did she need the champion's strength? And how could she keep everything hidden so well? Yet Nehemia could easily be a cunning actress, and maybe Selina had wanted a friend, wanted someone as different and outsiderish as she was. Maybe she'd been too willing, too desperate to see anything but what she wanted to see. Selina took a steadying breath. Nehemia loved Eloy. That was certainly true. And Selina knew there was nothing Nehemia wouldn't do to keep her country safe. Unless... Ice moved through Selina's veins. Unless Nehemia was here to start something bigger. Unless she didn't not only want to make sure the king spared Eloy at all. Unless she wanted what few dared whisper. Rebellion. And not rebellion as it was now, with rebel groups hiding out in the wilderness, but rather rebellion in the sense of entire kingdoms rising up against Adalin, as it should have been from the start. But why kill the champions? Why not target royals? The ball would have been perfect for that. Why use ward marks? She had seen Nehemia's rooms. There were no signs of a demon beast lurking about, and nowhere in the castle where she could. Selina's eyes rose from the book. Blocked by the giant chest of drawers, the tapestry still rippling in a phantom breeze. There was nowhere in the castle to summon or hide a creature like that, except for the endless, forgotten chambers and tunnels running beneath it. No, she said, standing so fast that it was all Fleetfoot could do to leap out of the way as her chair toppled over. No, it wasn't true. Because it was Nehemia. Because... Selina grunted as she pushed the chest to the side and folded the tapestry back from the wall. Just as it had 2 months ago, a cold, damp breeze leaked through the cracks. But it smelled nothing of roses. All of the murders had occurred within 2 days of a test. That meant tonight, or tomorrow, something would happen. The Ridderak, whatever it was to strike again. And with the marks she'd found painted under her bed, there was no way in hell she'd wait for it to show up. After shutting the whining Fleetfoot out of the bedroom, Selina covered the passageway entry with the tapestry, wedged a book in the doorway to keep from getting locked in, and only once wished she'd had a weapon beyond the candlestick she carried and the makeshift knife in her pocket. Because if Nehemia was truly lied to her like that, and if Nehemia was murdering the champions, then Selina had to see it herself. If only so she could kill her with her bare hands. Down and down she went, her breath thick in the frigid air, water dripping somewhere, and Selina looked longingly at the middle archway as she approached the crossroads. There was no thought of escape now. What would be the point when she was so close to winning? If she lost, she'd be sneaking back here before they had a chance to slip her off to Enderville again. Selena studied the left and right passages. The one to her left only led to a dead end, but the one on the right, that was the passage she'd taken to Eleanor's tomb. There she'd been countless other passageways, leading to unknown places. She stepped closer to the archway and froze when she saw the steps that ascended into the murky darkness. The centuries-old dust had been disturbed. Footprints led up and down. Nehemia and her creature must have been creeping around down here, just floors below everyone else. Hadn't Varen died just after he taunted her in front of Nehemia? Selena clutched her candlestick tighter and pulled a makeshift knife out of her pocket. Step after step, she began the descent down the stairwell. Soon she could no longer see the top landing, and the bottom never came any closer. But then whispers filled the corridor, slithering off the walls. She quietened her steps and shielded a candle as she neared it. It wasn't the idle chat of servants, but rather someone speaking rapidly, almost chanting. Not Nehemia. A man. A landing approached below, opening into a room to her left. A greenish light seeped out of it into the stones of the stairwell, which continued on past the landing and into darkness. The hair on her arms rose as the voice became clearer. It didn't speak any tongue that she recognized. It was guttural and harsh, and grated against her ears, as if it sucked the very warmth from her bones. The man panted as he spoke, like words burned his throat, and finally he gasped for air. Silence fell. Setting down a candle, Selena crept towards the landing and peered inside the room. The oaken door had been thrown open, a giant key turned in its rusting lock. And inside the small chamber, kneeling before a darkness so black that it seemed poised to devour the world, was Cain. Chapter 42. Cain. The person who'd gotten stronger and better as the competition went on. She thought it was his training, but it was because he'd been using the ward marks and the beast they summoned to steal the dead champion's strength. He dragged a hand across the floor before the darkness, and greenish light sprung up from where his fingers passed before being sucked into the void, like wraiths on the wind. One of his hands was bleeding. She didn't dare to breathe as something stirred in the darkness. There was a click of claw on stone, and a hiss like an extinguished flame. And then, stepping towards Cain on knees that bent the wrong way, like an animal's hind legs, the Rider-Rack emerged. It was something out of an ancient god's nightmare. Its hairless grey skin was stretched tightly across its misshapen head, displaying a gaping mouth filled with black fangs. Fangs that had ripped out and eaten Varen and Xavier's internal organs. Fangs that had feasted on their brains. Its vaguely human body sank onto its haunches, and it slid its long front arms across the stone floor. The stones whined under the claws. Cain raised his head and stood slowly as the creature knelt before him, and lowered its dark eyes. Submission. Selena only realized she was trembling when she made a step away, to flee as far and as fast as she could. Eleanor had been right. This was evil, plain and simple. The amulet pulsed at her neck, as if urging her to run. Her mouth dry, her blood pounding in her veins. She stepped back. Cain whirled to look at her, and the Rider-Rack's head shot up, its slitted nostrils sniffing twice. She froze, but as she did so, a massive wind shoved her from behind, making her stagger into the room. "It wasn't meant to be you tonight," Cain said, but Selena's eyes remained on the beast, who began panting. "But this opportunity is too good to go to waste." "Cain," was all she could say. The Rider-Rack's eyes, she'd never seen anything like them. There was nothing in them but hunger, endless, ageless hunger. The creature was not of this world. The ward marks worked. The gates were real. She pulled the makeshift knife out of her pocket. It was pitifully small. How could hairpins make a dent in that creature's hide? Cain moved so quickly she could only blink before he was behind her, her knife somehow now in his hand. No one human could move that fast. It was as if he were no more than shadows and wind. "Pity," Cain whispered from the doorway, pocketing a knife. Selena glanced at the creature, to him, and then back. "I'll never get to know how you wound up down here in the first place." His fingers wrapped around the door handle. Not that I care. Goodbye, Selena. The door slammed shut. The greenish light still seeped from the marks on the floor. Marks Kane had etched in his own blood, illuminating the creature who stared at her with those starving, relentless eyes. Kane, she whispered, backing to the door as she fumbled with the handle. She twisted and yanked. It was locked. There was nothing in this room but stone and dust. How had she let him disarm her that easily? Kane! The door wouldn't budge. Kane! She shouted, and banged on the door with a fist, hard enough to hurt. The rider axe stalked back and forth on its 4 long spidery limbs, sniffing at her, and Selena paused. Why didn't it attack immediately? It sniffed at her again, and swiped at the ground with a clawed hand, striking deep enough to take out a chunk of stone. It wanted her alive. Kane had incapacitated Varen while he summoned the creature. It liked its blood hot, so it would find the easiest way to immobilize her. And then she couldn't breathe. No, not like this. Not in this chamber, where no one would find her. Where Cole would never know why she disappeared, and would forever curse her for it. Where she'd never get the chance to tell Nehemia she had been wrong. And Eleanor. Eleanor said someone wanted her in the tomb. To see. To see what? And then she knew. The answer lay to her right. The right passage. The passage that led to the tomb a few levels below. The creature sank back on its haunches, poising to strike, and in that moment Selena came up with the most reckless and brave plan she'd ever concocted. She dropped her cape to the floor. With a roar that shook the castle, the Riderach ran for her. Selena remained before the door, watching as it galloped at her, sparks flying from its claws as he struck stone. 10 feet away, it leapt straight towards her legs. But Selena was already running straight at those black, rotten fangs. The Riderach jumped for her, and she hurtled over the snarling thing. A thunderous, splintering boom erupted through the chamber as the Riderach shattered the wooden door. She could only imagine what it had done to her legs. She didn't have time to think. She landed and whirled, charging back to where the creature had crashed through the door, and now sought to shake itself free of the pile of wood. She threw herself through the doorway and turned left, flying down the stairwell. She'd never make it back to her chambers alive, but if she was fast enough, perhaps she could make it to the tomb. The Riderach roared again, and the stairwell shuddered. She didn't dare to look behind. She focused on her feet, on keeping upright as she bounded down the stairs, making for the landing below, illuminated by moonlight leaking from the tomb. Selena hit the landing, ran for the tomb door, and prayed to gods whose names she'd forgotten, but who she'd hoped had not yet forgotten her. Someone wanted me to come here in Samhain. Someone knew this would happen. Eleanor wanted me to see it, so I could survive. The creature hit the bottom landing and charged after her, so close she could smell its reeking breath. The door to the tomb was wide open, as if someone had been waiting. Please, please. Grabbing onto the side of the doorway, she swung herself inside. She gained precious time as the rider skidded to a halt, missing the tomb. It only took a moment for her to recover and charge, taking off a chunk of the door as it entered. The pounding of her feet echoed through the tomb as she ran between the sarcophagi for Damarius, the sword of the ancient king. Displayed atop its stand, the blade shone in the moonlight, the metal still gleaming after 1,000 years. The creature snarled, and she heard its deep intake of breath, and the scrape of nails departing stone as the Riderach leapt for her. She lunged for the sword, her left hand wrapping around its cool hilt, as she twisted in the air and swung. She only had time to see its eyes and the blur of its skin before she drove Damaris through the Riderach's face. Pain lanced through her hand as they slammed against the wall and fell to the ground, scattering treasure. Black blood that stank of waste sprayed onto her. She didn't move. Not as she stared at those black eyes, barely inches from her own. Not as she stared at her right hand, held between its black teeth, her blood already oozing down its chin. She just panted and shook, not taking her left hand from the hilt of the sword, even after those hungry eyes turned dull, and his body sagged atop hers. It was only when the amulet throbbed again that she blinked. Everything after that became a series of steps, a dance that she had to execute perfectly or else she'd fall apart, right there in the tomb and never get up. She first pried her hand from its teeth. It burned mercilessly. An arc of gushing puncture wounds encircled her thumb, and she swayed on her feet as she shoved the Riderach off her. It was surprisingly light, as if its bones were hollow, or there were nothing inside it. Though the world became foggy around the edges, she yanked Damaris from its skull. She used the shirt to wipe Gavin's blade clean and set it back where it belonged. That was why they'd brought her to the tomb on Samhain, wasn't it? So she could see Damaris and have a way to save herself. She left the creature where it lay in a crumpled heap atop a pile of jewels. Whoever had wanted to save her could clean it up. She'd had enough. Still, Selena paused beside Eleanor's sarcophagus and looked at the beautiful face carved from marble. "Thank you," she said hoarsely. Her vision blurring, she left the tomb and staggered up the stairs, clutching a bleeding hand to her chest. When she was at last safely inside her chambers, Selena crossed to her bedroom door and leaned there, panting, as she unlocked it. Her wound had unclotted and blood was still pouring down her wrist. She listened to it drip onto the floor. She should go into the bathing room and wash her hand. Her palm felt like ice. She should... Her legs gave out and Selena collapsed. Her eyelids became heavy, so she closed them. Why did her heart beat so slowly? She opened her eyes to look at her hand. Her eyesight was blurry, and all she could make out was a mess of pink and red. The ice in her hand reached up to her arm, down to her legs. She heard booming, thunderous noise. A thump, 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 followed by a whine. Through her eyelids she could see the light in the room darken. She heard a cry, female, and warm hands grabbing her face. She was so cold it almost burned. Had someone left the window open? Lillian! It was Nehemia. She shook Selena's shoulders. Lillian, what happened to you? Selena remembered little of the next few moments. Strong arms lifted her up and rushed her into the bathing chamber. Nehemia strained as she carried Selena into the bathing pool, where she stripped away Selena's clothes. Selena's hand burned when it touched the water, and she thrashed, but the princess held her firm, saying words in a tongue the assassin didn't understand. The light in the room pulsed, and her skin tinged. Selena found her arms covered in glowing turquoise marks. Ward marks. Nehemia held her in the water, rocking back and forth. Blackness swallowed her up. Chapter 43. Selena opened her eyes. She was warm, and the candlelight was golden. She could smell lotus blossoms and a bit of nutmeg. She made a small noise and blinked, attempting to raise herself from the bed. What had happened? She could only recall climbing the stairs, then concealing the secret door behind the tapestry. Selena gave a start and grabbed at her tunic, gaping as she found that it had somehow turned to a nightgown, and then marveled at her hand as she lifted it into the air. It was healed. Completely healed. The only remnants of the wound was a half-moon-shaped scar between a thumb and index finger and little bite marks from the right axe's lower teeth. She ran a finger over each of the chalk-white scars, tracing their curve, then wiggling her fingers to ensure no nerves had been severed. How was this possible? It was magic. Someone had healed her. She lifted herself and saw that she was not alone. Nehemia sat in a chair nearby, staring at her. There was no smile on her lips, and Selena shifted as she beheld the mistrust in the young woman's eyes. Fleetfoot lay at her feet. What happened? Selena asked. That's what I have been waiting to ask you, said the princess in Healaway. She gestured at Selena's body. If I hadn't found you, you would have died from that bite within a few minutes. Even the blood she dropped on the floor had been cleaned. Thank you, she said, then started as she looked to the darkened sky beyond the windows. What day is it? If somehow 2 days had passed and she'd missed the last test. It's only been 3 hours. Selena's shoulders sagged. She hadn't missed it. She still had tomorrow to train and the test the day after that. I don't understand. That is not important, Nehemia interrupted. I want to know where you received that bite. There was blood only in your bedroom. No traces of it in the hallway or anywhere else. Selena clenched and unclenched her right hand, watching the scars stretch and contract. She had come so close to dying. She flicked her eyes to the princess, then back to her hand. Whatever Nehemia's involvement was, it wasn't with Cain. I'm not who I pretended to be, Selena said quietly, unable to meet her friend's eyes. Lillian Godiana doesn't exist. Nehemia didn't say anything. Selena made herself look her in the eye. Nehemia had saved her. How had she dared to believe that Nehemia might be someone, the one controlling that creature? The truth was the least she owed a friend. My name is Selena Sardathine. Nehemia's mouth parted. Slowly, she shook her head. But they sent you to Endeavor. You were supposed to be in Endeavor with... Nehemia's eyes widened. You speak the Eloi of the peasants, of those slaves in Endeavor. That is how you learned. Selena's breathing became a bit difficult. Nehemia's lips trembled. You went to Endeavor? Endeavor is a death camp, but why did you not tell me? Did you not trust me? Of course I do, she said, especially now that she had proven beyond a doubt that she wasn't the one responsible for those murders. I was ordered by the king not to speak a word of it. A word of what? Nehemia said sharply, blinking back her tears. The king knows you're here. He gives you orders. I'm here for his amusement. Nehemia sat up straighter in bed. I'm here because he's hosting a competition. To be the king's champion, and after I win, if I win, I'm to work for the king for 4 years, as his lackey and assassin, and then I'll be freed and my name cleared. Nehemia just looked at her, damning her with that blank stare. You think I want to be here? Selena shouted, even though it made her head pound. It is either this or Endeavor. I had no choice. She put a hand on her chest. Before you start lecturing me on my morality, or before you run away and hide behind your bodyguards, just know that there's not a moment that goes by that I don't wonder what it would be like to kill him. The man who destroyed everything I loved. She couldn't breathe fast enough, not as the door inside her mind opened and closed, and the images that the Selena had made herself forget flashed before her eyes. She closed them, wishing for darkness. Nehemia remained silent. Fleetfoot whined, and the quiet people, places, words echoed in her mind. Then footsteps. They brought her back. The mattress groaned inside as Nehemia sat. A second lighter weight joined her. Fleetfoot. Nehemia took Selena's hand in a warm, dry one. Selena opened her eyes, but stared at the wall across the room. Nehemia squeezed the hand. You're my dearest friend, Selena. It hurt me more than I realized it would. To have things become so cold between us. To see you look at me with such distrust in your eyes. And I don't want to ever see you look at me like that again. So I wish to give it to you, what I have given to few before. Her dark eyes shone. Names are not important. It's what lies inside of you that matters. I know what you went through in Endeavor. I know what my people endure there, day after day. But you did not let the mines harden you. You did not let it shame your soul into cruelty. The princess traced the mark on her hand, her fingers pressing into Selena's skin. You bear many names, and so I shall name you as well. A hand rose to Selena's forehead, and she drew an invisible mark. I name you Alentia. She kissed the assassin's brow. I give you this name to use with honor, to use when other names grow too heavy. I name you Alentia, spirit that cannot be broken. Selena was held in place. She could feel the name fall upon her like a shimmering veil. This was unconditional love. Friends like this did not exist. Why was she so fortunate as to have found one? Come, Nehemia said brightly. Tell me about how you became Adalin's assassin and how you wound up in this castle exactly. And what the details are of this absurd competition. Selena smiled slightly as Fleetfoot wagged her tail and licked Nehemia's arm. She had saved her life. Somehow. Answers for that would come later. So Selena spoke. The following morning, Selena walked beside Cole, her eyes on the marble floor of the hallway, the sun radiating off the snow in the garden, making the light in the hall nearly blinding. She told Nehemia almost everything. There were certain things that she'd never told anyone. She never hadn't mentioned Cain, or the creature either. Nehemia hadn't asked her again what had bitten her hand, but had stayed with her, curled up in bed as they talked long into the night. Selena, unsure how she ever slept again, now she knew what Cain could do, had been grateful for the company. She pulled her cloak tighter around her. The morning was unnaturally frigid. You're quiet today. Cole kept his gaze ahead of them. Did you and Dorian have a fight? Dorian. He'd stopped by last night, but Nehemia had shooed him off before he could enter the bedroom. No, I haven't seen him since yesterday morning. After the events of last night, yesterday morning seemed like a week ago. Did you enjoy dancing with him at the ball? Were his words a bit sharp? She turned to him as they rounded a corner, heading towards a private training room. You left rather early. I would have thought you'd wanted to guard me the whole night. You didn't need me to watch you anymore. I didn't need you to watch me from the start. He shrugged. Now I know you're not going anywhere. Outside, the howling wind kicked up a flurry of snow, sending a sparkling wave into the air. I could go back to Endeavor. You won't. How do you know that? I just know. That gives me a heap of confidence. He chuckled, continuing towards the sparring room. I'm surprised your dog didn't run after you, for all the crying she did just now. If you had a pet, you wouldn't make fun, she said gloomily. I've never had a pet. I never wanted one. That's probably a blessing for whatever dog might have wound up as your companion. He jabbed her with an elbow. She grinned and elbowed him back. She wanted to tell him about Cain. She wanted to tell him what she saw at her door this morning. She wanted to tell him everything. But he couldn't, no, because she realized last night, if she told him about Cain, the creature he'd unleashed, then he'd ask her to see the remains of the creature, and that meant taking him into the secret passage, while he might trust her enough to leave her alone with Dorian, knowing that she had access to an unguarded escape route was a test she wasn't ready to give Cole. Besides, I killed it. It's over. Elena's mysterious evil is vanquished. Now I just defeat Cain in the duel, and then no one needs to know. Cole stopped before the unmarked door of their practice room, and whirled to face her. I'm going to ask you this once, and then I won't ask it again, he said, staring at her so intensely that she shifted on her feet. Do you know what you're getting into with Dorian? She laughed, a harsh, cawing noise. Are you giving me romantic advice? And this is for my sake? Or Dorian's? Both. I didn't realize that you cared enough about me to bother, or even notice. To his credit, he didn't take the bait. Instead, he unlocked the door. Just remember to use your brain, will you? He said over his shoulder, and entered the room. An hour later, sweating and still panting from the swordplay practice, Selena wiped her brow on a sleeve as they made their way back to her rooms. The other day I saw you were reading Elric and Emid, he said. I thought you hated poetry. It's different, she swung her arms. Epic poetry isn't boring, or pretentious. Oh? A crooked smile twisted across his face. A poem about massive battles and boundless love isn't pretentious. Philippe punched his shoulder, and he laughed. Surprisingly delighted at his laughter, she cackled. But then they turned a corner, and guards filled the hall, and she saw him. The King of Adalin. Chapter 44. The King. Selena's heart gave a screech and dove behind her spine. Each of the little scars in her hand throbbed. He strode towards them, his monstrous form filling the too small hallway, and their eyes met. She went cold and hot at once. Cole halted and bowed low. Slowly, not wishing to find herself swinging from the gallows just yet, Selena bowed too. He stared at her with eyes of iron. The hair on her arms rose. She could feel him searching, looking for something inside of her. He knew that something was wrong, that something had changed in his castle, something to do with her. Selena and Cole rose and stepped inside. His head turned to examine her as he strode past. Could he see what lay beyond her flesh? Did he know that Cain had the ability to open portals, real portals to other worlds? Did he know that even though he'd banned magic, the Wardmarks still commanded a power of their own? Power the king could wield, if he learned to summon demons like the Riderak. There was a darkness in his eyes that felt foreign and cold, like the gaps between the stars. Could one man destroy a world? Was his ambition so consuming? She could hear the din of war. The king's head shifted to look at the hallway ahead. Something dangerous lurked around him. It was an air of death that she felt standing before the black void summoned by Cain. It was a stench of another world, a dead world. What was Eleanor's goal in demanding that she got close to him? Selena managed to walk, one step at a time, away from the king. Her eyes were far away and distant, and though she didn't look at Cole, she felt him studying her face. Thankfully, he didn't say a word. It was nice to have someone who understood. Cole didn't say anything when she moved closer to him for the remainder of their walk. Cole paced through his room, his time with Selena over until she trained with the other champions that afternoon. After lunch, he'd returned to his room to read the report detailing the king's journey, and in the past 10 minutes he'd read the thing 3 times. He crumbled the paper in his fist. Why had the king arrived alone? And more importantly, how had everyone in his traveling party died? It wasn't clear where he'd gone. He'd mentioned the White Fang Mountains, but why were they all dead? The king had vaguely hinted at some sort of issue with rebels poisoning their food stores, but the details were murky enough to suggest that the truth was buried somewhere else. Perhaps he hadn't fully explained it, because it would upset his subjects, but Cole was his captain of the guard. If the king didn't trust him... The clock struck, and Cole's shoulders sagged. Poor Selena. Did she know that she looked like a frightened animal when the king appeared? He'd almost wanted to pat her on the back. And the effect the king had had on her lasted long enough after their encounter. She had been distant during lunch. She was incredible now. So fast, he had difficulty keeping up with her. She could scale a wall with ease, and even demonstrated by climbing up to her own balcony with nothing but her bare hands. It unnerved him, especially when he remembered she was only 18. He wondered if this was how she'd been before Endeavor. She never hesitated when they sparred, but she seemed to sink far within herself, into a place that was calm and cool, but also angry and burning. She could kill anyone, Kane included, in a matter of seconds. But if she became champion, could they let her loose into Aurelia once more? He was fond of her, but Cole didn't know if he could sleep at night, knowing that he had retrained and released the world's greatest assassin. If she won, though, she'd be here for 4 years. What had the king thought when he saw them together laughing? Surely that hadn't been the reason for his neglecting to tell him what happened to his men. No, the king wouldn't bother to care about that kind of thing, especially if Selena might soon be his champion. Cole rubbed his shoulder. She looked so small when she saw the king. Since returning from his travels, the king hadn't seemed any different, and was just as gruff with Cole as he'd always been. But the sudden appearance, then returning without a soul. There was something brewing, a cauldron that the king had journeyed to stir. Selena somehow knew it too. The captain of the guard leaned against the wall, staring at the ceiling. He shouldn't press into the king's business. Right now his focus was on solving the murders of the champions, and on making sure Selena won. It wasn't even about Dorian's pride anymore. Selena wouldn't survive another year in Endeavor. Cole smiled slightly. She'd stirred up enough trouble in the months she'd been in the castle. He could only imagine what would happen over the next 4 years.